Genghis Khan never decided who came next. Genghis Khan built the largest contiguous land empire in human history, stretching from the Pacific coast of China to the edges of Eastern Europe. He was also, by almost any measure, a catastrophically bad planner when it came to succession. When he died in 1227, likely from injuries sustained during a campaign against the Shah, he left behind a vast empire with no clear legal framework for who controlled it. The Mongol tradition of dividing territory among sons seemed reasonable to him. He had multiple capable sons, and splitting inheritance was how steppe nomads had always managed power. The problem was that he had built something no steppe nomad had ever built before. The empire was too large, too complex, and too interconnected to survive being carved into competing pieces. Within 2 generations, his heirs were at war with each other. The unified military machine that had shattered every army in the known world began grinding itself apart. Every catastrophe that followed traces directly back to that single failure to establish a clear, indisputable line of succession. The Mongols provoked the Islamic world and made it personal. In 1219, Genghis Khan sent a trade caravan of several hundred merchants to the Khwarezmian Empire in Central Asia. The governor of the border city of Otrar had them all executed, apparently suspecting them of being spies. Genghis sent diplomatic envoys demanding justice. The Khwarezmian Shah, Muhammad II, had the envoys killed.
From a certain angle, the Shah's logic was understandable. He had a large army, strong cities, and no particular reason to fear a nomadic confederation from the east. What followed was one of the most complete destructions in recorded history. Genghis personally led the campaign. Samarkand fell. Bukhara burned. The Shah died fleeing across the Caspian Sea. Entire cities were depopulated. The irrigation systems that had sustained Central Asian civilization for centuries were deliberately wrecked and never fully recovered. The Mongols won every battle, but they also created a wound in the Islamic world that would never fully close.
The hatred generated by that campaign would eventually fuel the resistance that stopped the Mongol advance permanently at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260. Where Egyptian Mamluks handed the Mongols their first major battlefield defeat. The destruction had been total, but so was the motivation it created in those who survived. Ogedai Khan drank himself out of the conquest of Europe. By 1241, the Mongol armies under Batu Khan and the brilliant general Subutai had effectively destroyed every military force in Eastern Europe. Poland and Hungary had been crushed. German knights had been shattered at the Battle of Lignica. Subutai scouts were reportedly already probing toward Vienna. Western Europe had nothing left capable of stopping them. Then Ogedai Khan, Genghis's chosen successor and the ruler holding the empire together, died in December 1241. The cause was almost certainly alcohol. He had been warned repeatedly by his own physicians and family members that his drinking was killing him. He reportedly responded by promising to drink half as much, then immediately broke that promise. His death triggered the Mongol tradition of Kurultai, a great assembly where all senior leaders had to return to Mongolia to select a new Khan. Batu Khan turned his armies around and rode east. Europe never saw them again. The most powerful military force of the medieval world abandoned its greatest conquest not because of any army, fortress, or act of resistance, but because the man at the top could not stop drinking. Western Europe was saved by a liver. The Mongols tried to invade Japan twice and ignored every warning. In 1274, Kublai Khan launched his first invasion of Japan with roughly 23,000 troops. The campaign ran into fierce resistance from Japanese warriors, and then a severe storm that damaged the fleet badly enough to force a retreat. A reasonable leader might have taken this as a signal. Kublai Khan sent diplomatic envoys to Japan, demanding submission. Japan executed them. In 1281, Kublai launched a second invasion, this time with a force estimated at over 100,000 men, one of the largest amphibious operations in medieval history. The Japanese defenders held the beachheads with extraordinary tenacity, while the massive Mongol fleet sat anchored offshore. Then, a typhoon hit. The Chinese and Korean ships, built for river and coastal use rather than open ocean conditions, were devastated. Estimates suggest tens of thousands of Mongol soldiers drowned or were killed on the beaches. The Japanese called the storms kamikaze, divine winds. The invasions drained enormous resources from the Yuan dynasty, damaged Kublai's reputation for invincibility, and demonstrated clearly that the Mongol model of overwhelming land warfare could not simply be transplanted to naval operations. The empire had found the edge of what it could actually do, and it had found it the expensive way. Kublai Khan spent money he did not have. Kublai Khan was a genuinely sophisticated ruler in many respects. He patronized trade, supported infrastructure, and governed a vast population with considerable administrative skill. He was also financially reckless on a scale that destabilized his entire dynasty. The failed Japan invasions were expensive. His campaigns in Vietnam and Java, which also failed, were expensive. His massive construction projects were expensive. To pay for all of it, Kublai's government printed paper money in quantities that the underlying economy could not support. Merchants began refusing it. Inflation spiraled. The Yuan dynasty's financial credibility collapsed. Kublai had inherited the Mongol assumption that conquest would always generate enough new wealth to fund the next conquest. When the conquests stopped producing returns, the entire economic model broke down. By the time of his death in 1294, the Yuan dynasty was financially hollowed out, relying on increasingly worthless currency and increasingly resentful subject populations. The economic damage he caused outlasted him by decades. The Golden Horde and the Ilkhanate went to war with each other. One of the most strategically absurd chapters in Mongol history is the decades-long war between two Mongol successor states, the Golden Horde in the north and the Ilkhanate in Persia. The conflict began over disputed territory in the Caucasus and was inflamed by religious differences, with the Golden Horde increasingly aligned with Islam and the Ilkhanate initially tolerant of Christianity and Buddhism. Both states were ruled by descendants of Genghis Khan. Both were fighting armies built on the same tactics, trained by the same traditions, using the same equipment. They knew exactly how each other fought. The wars were therefore brutal, prolonged, and deeply damaging to both sides. While the Mongols were busy killing each other in the Caucasus, the Mamluks consolidated power in Egypt. The Delhi Sultanate strengthened its defenses, and the Chinese population under Yuan rule organized the resistance that would eventually expel the Mongols entirely. The empire that had conquered the world by concentrating force spent its middle age dispersing that force against itself. The Black Death traveled the Mongol roads. The Mongols built the most efficient long-distance road and trade network the medieval world had ever seen. The Yam system, a network of relay stations stretching across the entire empire, allowed messengers, merchants, and armies to move at speeds that astonished contemporary observers. It was a genuine administrative achievement. It also created a perfect transmission corridor for Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for bubonic plague. The Black Death almost certainly originated in Central Asian rodent populations and spread westward along Mongol trade routes in the 1340s. When Mongol forces besieging the Crimean trading city of Kaffa began dying of plague in 1346, they reportedly catapulted infected corpses over the city walls, one of the earliest recorded instances of biological warfare. Genoese merchants fleeing Kaffa carried the plague to Sicily, and from there across Europe. The pandemic killed roughly a third of Europe's population and devastated the Middle East and Central Asia.
The Mongol successor states, sitting directly on the trade routes, suffered catastrophic population losses. The infrastructure that had been the empire's greatest strength became the mechanism of its demographic destruction. The Yuan dynasty forgot that someone had to actually farm. The Mongols who ruled China under the Yuan dynasty were conquerors who had never particularly valued agriculture. In the early decades of their rule, some Mongol officials seriously proposed converting farmland back into pasture for horses. Cooler heads prevented the worst of this, but the underlying attitude persisted. Chinese farmers were taxed heavily, treated as a subordinate class, and excluded almost entirely from administrative positions. Corruption among Mongol officials was widespread and largely unpunished. When the Yellow River flooded catastrophically in the 1340s, and the government's response was to conscript hundreds of thousands of laborers under brutal conditions, the resentment that had been building for generations finally ignited. The Red Turban Rebellion spread across China with extraordinary speed because it was not simply a peasant uprising, but a nationwide rejection of foreign rule by a population that had been humiliated and exploited for nearly a century. Zhu Yuanzhang, the son of a peasant farmer, led the rebellion that expelled the Mongols and founded the Ming dynasty in 1368. The Yuan dynasty had ruled China for less than 100 years. They had never understood that an empire built on conquered farmers requires those farmers to believe, however minimally, that the arrangement is survivable. Timur finished what the Mongols had started on themselves. By the late 14th century, the Mongol successor states were weakened, fractured, and exhausted by internal conflict. What they needed was time and stability. What they got was Timur, also known as Tamerlane, a Turkic Mongol warlord who claimed descent from Genghis Khan and used that claim to legitimize a campaign of conquest that systematically destroyed what remained of Mongol power across Central Asia and the Middle East. Timur defeated and captured the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid at the Battle of Ankara in 1402. He shattered the Golden Horde so completely that it never recovered as a unified political force. He sacked Delhi and left a trail of pyramids built from skulls across Persia and Iraq. He did not build a stable empire so much as he demolished everything around him. The Mongol successor states that survived him did so as shadows of their former power. The Golden Horde fragmented into smaller khanates that were absorbed one by one over the following centuries. The last of these, the Crimean Khanate, finally ended in 1783 when Catherine the Great annexed it into the Russian Empire. The empire that had once made the world tremble ended not with a single catastrophic defeat, but with a slow erosion across 5 centuries, each mistake compounding the last until there was nothing left to compound.